Hello, everybody. We are so glad to see you here for our session on Scene with Savannah. I see there are already some Savannah fans in the chat, which is great. I am so excited for this session. Before we begin, just to make sure everything is working properly, if you can see and hear us, we've got people telling us where they're from in the chat. So tell me if you've had lunch yet today, I guess, what you had for lunch, or what you're going to have for lunch if you are in Pacific time and are before lunch. Bobby, no lunch, pizza, grapes. Ooh, grapes are my favorite. Fish dinner, about to eat bagel, breakfast soon, just finished lunch, fish, stir fry. Oh my gosh. Okay. Things are working and everyone is eating lunch or will have lunch soon. Some just had dinner as well. Loaded baked potato, yum. Okay. It's so great to see so many of you here again. Before we get started, just a couple quick bits of housekeeping. First, if you're not receiving our emails, don't worry. We have our developers looking into it, so we should hopefully have an update for that very, very soon. Again, tomorrow is the premium only day, so if you are not a member of ProWritingAid Premium yet, I'm dropping the link in the chat. There's 40% off offer going now for yearly or lifetime, and it gets you access to all of our sessions tomorrow, as well as replays of these sessions beyond the 1 week mark. But we have a conversation with VE Schwab tomorrow that's amazing. I'm so excited to talk about it. And as long as you join by kind of midnight tonight, you will be able to get the links for tomorrow. So that is first. Second is we would love to hear what you think about Fantasy Writers Week. So I'm dropping a survey into the chat. It would be really, really helpful if you can fill that out and share lots of nice things about your time this week and what you've learned. It really helps us be able to continue to bring these events to you for free. Okay, that's all of my housekeeping. So during this session, if you have questions for Savannah, please use the Q&A box, which will help me keep track of questions that come in since our chat is moving so fast. And if you want to connect with other participants, please make sure to select everyone from the drop-down menu. And with all of that taken care of, we can begin. I am here with Savannah Gilbo, who is a certified developmental editor and book coach who helps fiction authors write, edit, and publish stories that work. Savannah is also the host of the top-rated Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast, where she delivers weekly episodes full of simple, actionable, and step-by-step strategies that you can implement in your writing right away. When she's not doing all of that, you can find Savannah curled up with a good book, a cozy blanket, and her 3 furry partners in crime, I think one of which is right with her now, so maybe we'll get a cameo today. And yeah, welcome, Savannah. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much, Haley. I'm so excited to be here. And hi, everybody. Enjoy your lunches or breakfasts or dinners or whatever you got. I have my coffee because I'm in Pacific time, so a little late second coffee cup of the day. But yeah, so let's go ahead. Let me see if I can share my screen. Haley, you'll let me know if this works. Okay, so you should see it now. Is it all looking good?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, perfect. And you guys can hear me. So, okay, today's masterclass, we're going to talk about writing scenes. Specifically, I'm going to show you how to write compelling, well-structured scenes so that you don't waste your time or your words, and so that you can make the biggest impact on readers with your story. So something I like to do after one of these trainings is jump on social media and see all the posts that you have done throughout our time together. And I like to reshare them on my page. So if you would like a shout out on Instagram, and if you want to show me where and how you're tuning in today, then post something on Instagram stories and tag me at savannah.gilbo. That way I can see all your posts and reshare them on my page as well. So let's have some fun over the next hour, take some photos or screenshots and tag me in them so I can get them and post them on my page. Sound good? So as Haley mentioned, let me just do a quick little introduction. I'm Savannah. I'm a certified developmental editor and book coach, which is a fancy way of saying I help writers write, edit, and publish stories that work. I also host the Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast that you can check out wherever you normally listen to podcasts. And lastly, I was named one of the top 10 book coaches to watch in 2021, which I still think is a little bit crazy, but also pretty dang cool. So that's a very quick summary of who I am and what I do. Now, let me tell you where we're going in today's training. So first, we're going to talk about why you should write in scenes, not chapters. Then we're going to talk about what a scene really is, and maybe more importantly, what a scene is not. We're going to talk about approximately how long each of your scenes should be. And then we're going to talk about 5 elements you need to include in each one of your scenes for it to be considered properly structured. After that, we're going to look at how those 5 elements that I teach you show up in a scene from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And then we're going to have time for a live Q&A. So I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible so that we have the most possible time for a Q&A. So feel free to take screenshots of the slides or, go to savannahgilbo.com/PWA to get a free download that recaps everything you're going to learn here today. I'm going to leave this up for a second in case you're copying the link. The other cool thing about this guide is that it includes a full breakdown of how the structure I'm going to teach you shows up in a scene from the Hunger Games. So we'll see a scene from Harry Potter today, and there's a scene from the Hunger Games in the guide. So this guide includes my line-by-line feedback, as well as my notes about where the key structural moments in that scene occurs. So savannahgilbo.com, PWA, if you want to get your hands on that. And I'll remind you again at the end, so no stress. So like I mentioned earlier, we're talking about writing compelling scenes. And the title of my presentation says that scenes are the building block of story, right? So let's quickly talk about what the difference between scenes and chapters to make sure we're all on the same page. So scenes and chapters are different, and they each serve a different purpose in your story. Scenes are mini stories that link together to create your overarching story. They need to have their own beginning, middle, and end, as well as a clear arc of change. And then chapters are arbitrary divisions within a story that mainly exist to control how the reader experiences your story. So unlike scenes, chapters don't have anything to do with story structure. It's all about reader experience. Sometimes a single scene can make up one chapter, and other times a group of related scenes work together to make a similar point or to set up a pivotal moment within one of the chapters. Both scenes and chapters do play a role in your story's pacing, but chapters are much more obvious to the reader and therefore give you more control over how a reader experiences your story. So for example, a novel with short chapters is going to feel different or have a quicker pace than a novel with long chapters. So that's the difference on scenes versus chapters. And now let me tell you 3 reasons why I recommend you write your draft in scenes and not chapters. So reason number 1 is that it's easier to plan your story, especially if you like mapping out your scene count before you start writing. So for example, let's pretend that you're writing an 80,000 word draft. And if you know that, or if you follow the common advice that says the beginning of a story is usually about 25% of the total word count, you know that your total word count for the beginning is going to be about 20,000 words. And if you approximate that your scenes will be somewhere between 2,000 words each, then you can assume you're going to need about 10 scenes in the beginning section of your story. And of course, you can go up or down from there. It's just a way to give yourself an estimate and kind of a roadmap to work within. So personally, this is how I break down my story when I'm outlining, planning things out way before I start writing a single word, because I like to know how many scenes I have to work with in total and then in each act. And that way it's super clear to me if my story is going off track at any point, or if I'm just kind of following a tangent that I don't need to be following. So as an example, if I've planned 10 scenes for the beginning of my story, and if I'm already on scene number 18 and I haven't exited the beginning yet, then I know that something is wrong. So either my story is going to be a lot longer than I've expected, and I need to plan for that, or I've overwritten the whole thing and I just need to tighten things up. But in most cases, this would tell me that my plot points aren't where they need to be, or that I have scenes in my story that don't really need to be there. So again, there's no exact rule here. These are just helpful guidelines. And that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is that it's easier and less stressful to write a first draft when you write in scenes, not chapters. And I've worked with a lot of writers who really worry about ending chapters on cliffhangers, or who agonize over writing the perfect chapter opening. And they worry so much about these things that they never end up making progress toward finishing their draft. But if you can get in the habit of writing in scenes, not chapters, there are many benefits, 3 of which we'll go over now. So first, you'll be able to write a more complete and well fleshed out draft, because you're going to be focused on creating the shape and structure of each scene instead of ending or starting your chapter with something really exciting or a cliffhanger. Second, you won't have to worry about how each chapter ends or how it transitions. You can just write each complete scene and move on to the next and the next until you're finished. And then third, when it's time to break your story into chapters, you can then make sure your chapter breaks fall at the most exciting or interesting parts. That way the reader's going to feel that tug and they're going to want to keep reading. This also is going to help you avoid a bunch of things that happen in each chapter. And instead, you'll be focused more on writing actual scenes that advance the story and the plot, which is what we all want, right? And as I mentioned earlier, this is going to make a huge impact on the quality of your first draft. So reason number 3 that you want to write in scenes versus chapters is that it's easier to spot a weak scene when you're editing. A weak scene is something, or a weak scene that falls in the middle of a good chapter is easy to skip or not notice during the editing stage, especially if the things or the scenes and chapters around it are relatively good. But when a scene is by itself in its own file, its flaws or its weaknesses stand out. So in other words, it's easier to see where it's falling flat and how it's not really maybe doing anything to serve the bigger story. So this is a great exercise to do if you have a lot of backstory or if you have a lot of world building, which I think most of us are writing science fiction or fantasy, so we will, because all of that exposition or info dumping that we can sometimes do really stands out in a scene when it's sitting in a file all by itself. So those are the 3 reasons I highly recommend you plan, write, and edit your novel in scenes and not chapters. And then once you're all the way done with your draft and you feel good about where your story's at, you can break up your story and your scenes into chapters to better control how the reader will experience it. So let's dig a little deeper into what a scene actually is, and then more importantly, maybe what a scene is not. So a quick Google search will give you a ton of different answers on what a scene is and how to write one, but the one I see most often is a version of this. And spoiler alert, don't write this down. You're going to have an opportunity to write a better definition down in a couple slides. So Google says a scene is a unit of action that takes place in one setting, features a specific cast of characters, is told from one point of view. When either the setting, the cast of characters, or the point of view changes, the scene is over. And for the most part, that is true, but it leaves something that's really important out of the equation. And that is that in a scene, something has to change. So a scene needs to start in one place and end up somewhere else, whether that be a change in the physical location, a change in a mental state, a change in a relationship, or a change in the amount of knowledge that one of your characters has. So there must be some kind of meaningful change from start to finish. And by meaningful change, I really just mean that the change must impact the overarching story, because otherwise, if it doesn't, there might not be a very good reason for including it in your story. So here is a revised definition for you that you can screenshot, write down, do whatever you want with. A scene is a unit of story that takes place in more or less continuous space and time, features a specific cast of characters, is told from one point of view, and contains a mini arc of change from beginning to end. And if you guys do grab the freebie that I mentioned earlier, this definition is in there. But like I mentioned, go ahead and screenshot that, or write it down on a sticky note to put by your desk or in your writing notebook or wherever you keep important notes. So I will take a sip of coffee in case people are writing that down. Okay. So now that we know what a scene is, let's talk about what a scene is not, because this is equally important. A scene is not a lengthy description of the setting, characters, or the weather. A scene is not a handful of characters sitting around reflecting or thinking. A scene is not a bunch of random events that seem to happen or that don't add to the overarching story. And finally, a scene is not paragraphs of backstory that include explanations of the character's past. Now, all that being said, you can certainly have some of these things within a scene, but they don't make a scene on their own, because on their own, that's really just stuff that's sitting on a page and there's no movement pushing or pulling the reader forward. So now that we're on the same page about what a scene is and what a scene is not, let's quickly talk about word count, and then we're going to dive into how to actually start writing your scenes. So a question I get asked all the time is, how long should each of my scenes be? And I always recommend writing scenes somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 words, depending on your genre. And the reason for this is that, let's say a 2,000 word scene It's long enough to convey what's happening, but it's short enough to hold your reader's attention and make them want to continue reading. And also, I've worked with hundreds of writers at this point, and I know that this is a good number to aim for, even if you don't eventually land there. So just something to keep in mind. Now, let's talk about how to write a well-structured scene using the 5 commandments of storytelling. And you might remember in the beginning, I mentioned that I'm a StoryGrid certified editor. So if you're familiar with the StoryGrid method, you will recognize these scene elements that we're about to go over. But if you're not familiar with them, that's okay too. I will explain each one as we dig in. So the very first thing before we dive into each of those 5 elements that you need to know is that every scene needs to start with the point of view character's goal. So what does this person want to achieve or accomplish or learn or do in this scene? Like, what are they trying to do when the scene opens? And this could literally be anything. So it could be as simple as your character wanting to go down to the river to fill up a bucket of water so that he can make breakfast for his family. Or it can be as complex as your character wanting to confront and defeat the evil Dark Lord. So the key thing is that your character needs to be trying to accomplish or do or learn something in each scene, and it needs to be clear within the first few paragraphs. And that's just because we want readers to be able to latch onto that character and say, okay, they care about something, they're trying to do something, I'm invested. So that's the first thing. Point of view character needs a goal. And then the 5 commandments of storytelling come in and help you create a mini arc of change through the conflict your character faces as they pursue that goal. So here are the 5 commandments at a glance. You need to have an inciting incident, a turning point, a crisis, a climax, and a resolution. Commandment number 1 is that there needs to be an inciting incident. And this is really just the first thing that gets in your character's way of accomplishing their goal. So it's that first bit of conflict or the first unexpected thing that happens as your character pursues their scene goal. Now, at this stage of the scene, the inciting incident can cause your character to come up with a new scene goal, or it can cause your character to adjust their scene goal. It depends on what the inciting incident is and what you need your character to accomplish in the rest of the scene. But that's commandment number 1. There needs to be an inciting incident or something unexpected that gets in the way of your character pursuing their original goal. Commandment number 2 is that there needs to be moments of escalating conflict that lead to a turning point. And really, I like to focus on the turning point for this commandment. So a turning point is a moment where the conflict reaches its peak and the character can no longer go after their scene goal in the way they had originally planned. So the way I like to think about this is it's kind of like the final straw. They've faced so much conflict or so many obstacles throughout the scene that things can no longer go according to plan. And turning points can show up in one of 2 ways. So you can have an active turning point or a revelatory turning point. And an active turning point just means that something happened in the physical world that acts as the peak moment of conflict and causes a change in plans. So something that's happening outside of the character. A revelatory turning point happens when the character gains new information or when they realize something based on that new information that changes the circumstances or their plans. So something happens and it's that realization or that revelation that changes circumstances or plans. So that's commandment number 2. There needs to be a turning point that is the peak moment of conflict. Commandment number 3 is that there needs to be a crisis moment or a moment where your character faces a decision about how to move forward. So after the turning point comes in and ruins your character's plans for achieving their scene goal, they're going to need to decide what to do next. So will they do X or will they do Y? And ideally, you want these options to carry the same weight. So in other words, your character should face a choice between 2 equally good or 2 equally bad things. And the reason for this is because if you have to choose between a good thing and a bad thing, you're obviously going to choose the good thing, right? It's a predictable decision. So readers don't want that kind of predictable decision. If you had to choose between 2 equally bad or 2 equally good things, then the choice is much more interesting for readers to read about, and it just creates that sense of conflict and stakes. So with either choice, speaking of stakes, there needs to be something at stake. So if they choose to do option X, what do they stand to lose or gain? If they choose to do option Y, what do they stand to lose or gain? This is how you make things interesting and keep readers on the edge of their seats wondering what's going to happen throughout the entire story. So that's commandment number 3. There needs to be a crisis moment or a moment where your character faces a decision about how to move forward in each and every one of your scenes. Commandment number 4 is that there needs to be a climax or a moment where your character acts on their choice. So did they choose X or did they choose Y? And this is one of the main ways that you can show readers who your characters are. So through the decisions they make in each one of your scenes. And that's because the dilemma or that crisis moment that your character faces will have consequences no matter what they do. So their decision will prove something to readers about who they are and what they value. And as the story progresses and as your character grows and changes, their decisions from scene to scene will begin to shift. And that's because what they value and what they believe is changing. By the end of the story, the person that your character has become will ideally be somebody who makes very different choices than the person they started the story as. And sometimes this just feels different internally. So maybe they've always been righteous, but now they are more, I guess, solidified in their confidence about making these righteous decisions. So just an example. And this is why in most cases, you're going to want your point of view character to be taking the action or making the decision in the climactic moment. So in other words, we don't want side characters or somebody else owning the majority of the scene decisions. Because if you do that, you risk creating a protagonist or a point of view character that has no agency. And when that happens too much, it starts to feel like the story belongs to somebody else. So just something to keep in mind. And that's commandment number 4. There needs to be a climax in each scene or a moment where your character takes action on their choice. Finally, commandment number 5 is the resolution, which basically is the moment where we get a glimpse into how your character's decision worked out for them. So how does your character feel now that they've acted on their choice? Do they feel confident? Do they regret their decision? Do they wish they could have been a little bit braver? Were there immediate consequences for whatever they chose to do? And if so, how do they feel about that? This is also where you can establish that sense of forward momentum into the next scene. So everything that happened in this current scene, and now that they've made this decision, what's their plan going forward? And at the end of each scene, it's sometimes helpful to ask ourselves, because of what just happened, what will my character do next? Or what is the inevitable result of the choice that my character just made? Sometimes we do get a glimpse of the character's plan in that climactic moment, but other times the characters will form a plan here in the resolution. So it really just depends on the makeup of each of your individual scenes. But anyway, that is commandment number 5. There needs to be a resolution in each one of your scenes. And that is the structure of how to write a scene. So you have a point of view character with a goal, you throw those 5 commandments in their way, and voila, you have a mini arc of change. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to is just because there's a mini arc of change, or just because these 5 commandments are present in each of your scenes, it doesn't mean that they deserve a spot in your novel. Every scene should link in some way to the overarching plot and to your character's arc, ideally by helping them solve a piece of the plot puzzle and by challenging their inner obstacle. So that outdated belief or that outdated worldview or whatever fear or misbelief that they have to overcome in the story. If a scene does not advance your story towards that, global climax or that eventual outcome, then you should find a way to either connect it to the spine of your story or consider cutting it all together. So now let's take a look at those 5 commandments in action, because I think that's just easier to learn by example. And we're going to look at a scene from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone because it's one of my favorite books. I'm not going to read the whole scene word for word, but I did write up a quick summary that I will read to refresh your memory or to set the stage in case you're not familiar with the story. But if you do want to read the entire scene, it's chapter 7 of the first Harry Potter book. So in this scene, Harry has just arrived at Hogwarts and Professor McGonagall announces that the new group of first years will be sorted into their schoolhouses before dinner. Harry is nervous because he doesn't want to be the center of attention. And when it's his turn to be sorted, he's also a bit worried about what will happen if the sorting hat doesn't think he belongs in any house. So what will happen if nobody wants him? Or what will happen if he has to go back to the Dursleys? But when it's Harry's turn to be sorted, he puts on the sorting hat and listens as it weighs his qualities and his personality traits. So as it's doing that, Harry starts to worry that he'll be put in Slytherin. So he tells the hat, not Slytherin, not Slytherin. The hat takes Harry's preferences into consideration and decides to put him in Gryffindor. And after that, he joins everybody else at the Gryffindor table, listens to Dumbledore's speech, and he eats dinner. So that's the scene in a nutshell. I see some notes in the chat. It's Philosopher's Stone in the UK, Sorcerer's Stone in the US. Sorry for that confusion. But let's go ahead and break that scene down. So what is Harry's scene goal? In this scene, Harry's goal is to get settled at Hogwarts. He and the rest of the first years just arrived. So for Harry, it's all about getting settled and figuring out what's next. He just wants to get the lay of the land and see where he fits in. So what are the 5 commandments? Well, the inciting incident is when Professor McGonagall tells the first years that they're going to be sorted into their school houses before dinner. So this is the inciting incident because Harry had no idea it was coming and he had no way of preparing for this moment. So this changes his initial scene goal just slightly because now he wants to figure out which house he belongs to or where he belongs so that he can settle in to Hogwarts properly. So that's the inciting incident. The turning point is when the sorting hat seems to be having trouble deciding where to put Harry, and it mentions placing him in Slytherin. So this is the turning point because Harry doesn't want to be in Slytherin and he realizes that it's now a likely outcome. So because of that, he faces a choice. I see everybody putting their school houses in the chat, and I will chime in that I am a proud Ravenclaw. So I see all you other Ravenclaws. That's awesome. But go ahead. Everybody put their houses in the chat. I love that. Okay, so the crisis in this scene is, should Harry speak up about not wanting to be in Slytherin and risk drawing unnecessary attention to himself? Or should Harry let the sorting hat choose which house to put him in and risk being sorted into Slytherin? So the climax of the scene is that Harry tells the sorting hat that he doesn't want to be in Slytherin. And this is the climax because he's taking action on one of those 2 choices. The resolution is that Harry is sorted into Gryffindor and he feels an immense sense of relief. So I will leave that up for a second while I grab a sip of coffee in case you guys want to take a screenshot of that, or put your schoolhouse in the chat. I see there's a bunch of them coming through. And I don't know about you guys, but we have given schoolhouses to each of our 3 dogs. So we have 2 Gryffindors and a Hufflepuff. And then I'm a Ravenclaw and my boyfriend's a Hufflepuff. So we have a nice mix. My brother is a Slytherin. I wish I would have brought, this is a total side note, I wish I would have brought it, but my brother for Christmas got me an actual Hogwarts letter that came to my house, and it opened up in the exact same way that a regular Hogwarts letter in the movie would. So it was really cool. I wish I would have brought it because it's awesome. Okay, so why is this a good example? So the 5 commandments to me in this scene are, and the arc of change are really clear. Not only that, but there are also a lot of great details that show readers who Harry is in this scene. So for example, he's really worried about what might happen if he's not sorted into any house. And we know that he's so used to feeling like he doesn't belong with the Dursleys that not belonging has almost become his default worldview. So what if he doesn't really belong anywhere? That's a realistic fear for him. And if he doesn't belong, what does that mean? What's at stake? So will he have to go back to the miserable life he had at the Dursleys, or does it mean something else? He doesn't even know at this point. We also get to see the kind of person that Harry is when he asks the sorting hat to not put him in Slytherin. So in previous chapters or moments, we saw, like in Diagon Alley and on the Hogwarts Express, we've already seen examples of the kind of person that Draco Malfoy is. And we know that he was immediately sorted into Slytherin. So he gets sorted before Harry does. And not only that, but we know that Ron gave Harry his 2 cents about what it means to be in Slytherin house while they were waiting, in the Great Hall or outside the Great Hall for McGonagall to bring them in. So through Harry's choice to stand up for himself, we get a really good glimpse at the kind of person he is and the kind of person he wants to be by this one moment of action. And that's what I meant earlier when I said that in each scene, that crisis and climax moment is a really great opportunity for you to show readers who your character is and how they're going to change over time. This scene is also a really good example of how Harry takes what little action he can, even though he's not ultimately in charge of the outcome. So the Sorting Hat will definitely be the one who makes the final choice regarding which house Harry belongs to, but Harry's not a passive protagonist, right? He still tries to take control of his fate by using what little agency and control that he does have. Now, one quick thing I want to point out is that this example is a little long. It's about 4,500 words. So remember earlier I said try to aim between 1,500 to 2,500 words, right? Well, not only is this J.K. Rowling, so she can get away with this, but this is also a special scene because it's Harry's first introduction to Hogwarts and the rest of the first year students and how everything during the start of term works, including the Sorting Hat. So there is a lot to unpack and set up in this scene. And if you're writing science fiction or fantasy, which I know many of you are, that's why we're here, you might have scenes that are longer than the recommended word count that I gave you earlier from time to time. And that's completely normal. But if you start to notice that your entire draft is full of scenes that are 5,000 plus words long, that is likely indicative of a bigger problem. So just keep that in mind. I still definitely do recommend aiming for somewhere between 1,500 to 2,500 words, especially in your early drafts. And then you can, tweak from there based on what you need. So now you know how to write compelling, well-structured scenes so that you don't waste your time or your words, and so that you can make the biggest impact on readers with your story. And before we dive into Q&A, let's just do a very quick recap of the key points because I know we went over a lot very quickly. So key point number 1 is that a scene is a unit of story that takes place in more or less continuous space and time, features a specific cast of characters, is told from one point of view, and contains a mini arc of change. Key point number 2 is that ideally you'd aim for scenes that are 1,500 to 2,500 words in length. This is a long enough length to convey what's happening in a scene, but it's short enough to make readers want to continue reading. And finally, key point number 3 is that to write a solid, well-structured scene, you need to know your point of view character's goal. You need to include the 5 elements, so the inciting incident, the turning point, the crisis, the climax, and the resolution, to create a mini arc of change. So with that being said, we can move into the Q&A. It looks like, Haley, we have about 30 minutes to do Q&A, which is awesome.
Yes, so, and we have a lot of questions, so awesome. We can jump right into them.
Let's do it.
So we've got a bunch that are about scenes and then just in general about writing as well. So we'll just dive in from the top. So the first person asks about the process of you becoming a developmental editor. Did you take a course, or were there books that you read, or what would you recommend for people who are interested in that?
Sure. So I have 2 certifications. I have one through the Story Grid, which you can just Google. They have a developmental editor certification program. The second certification I have is through Author Accelerator, and that's more for book coaching, but still a lot of developmental editing. So you can just look them up too, Author Accelerator book coaching program. I did both of those certification courses, and they both require some real life practical work. So you get a lot of experience that way. And then, you just dig in and get going.
Awesome. Someone else asked, how does thinking about scenes like this apply if you are a pantser or somebody who doesn't like to plan out your books from the beginning?
Okay, this is a great question. And I deleted some slides and I wish I would have kept them in. I wanted to go quick, but here's what I would do if I were a pantser. So I would remember, and I work with a lot of pantsers, so I totally feel the crunch of, oh my gosh, I can't remember these 5 things. But what I would do is think about goal, conflict, and decision. And if you can just keep those 3 things in mind, even if you don't get them right in every scene, or if you don't include them in every scene, just having that in your head is already going to help you write stronger first drafts. So if you'll notice, the goal we talked about, the 5 commandments basically equal that conflict. And then that crisis is the decision. So those are the 3 things I would try to remember if I was a pantser.
Yeah. And I think you can always also come back to it during editing as well. And I think with pantsers, a lot of the times it ends up being like, okay, let me come back to this manuscript and see if the structure fits at that point. And then you can, at the editing process, tweak things to kind of make it fit those
For sure.
those commandments. Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing I noticed too is it's so funny because most of us writers tend to have one of those structural elements that gives us problems. So if you are a pantser and you do come back, you might notice that you have a good chunk of these things already. But maybe usually it's the crisis moment that kind of eludes most people. So, once you identify what is that element that I tend to be missing, you can pay more attention to that as you go through your edits or as you write your next draft.
Yeah. Okay. Someone asked, how do you label your scene files? It's easier for me to organize chapter by chapter, but scene files feel a little bit more complex to organize when writing.
Yeah, so that's a good question. If it were me, I would probably do it the same way that you're doing your chapters, but I would just do it by scene. So scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, each in their own file. And then once I get to the stage where I'm confident in my scene structure, I would probably compile everything into one document or then break it out into chapters. And I see people in the chat mentioning Scrivener. So that is something I use too. And it really helps you with compiling and then kind of being able to break it out however you want. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. And there's so many different softwares. And I think a lot of it is just finding what works for you as well and seeing like, what is a file system that makes sense for me.
Yeah. One thing I'll add in too, I don't know if you guys ever use the heading function in Google Doc or Word, but that's something that a lot of the writers I work with have been using now because you can pull up a table of contents on the side. And if you do keep everything in one document, you can easily find like where scene 7 is or, from the little headers you make.
Really. Okay, Jinian asked, do your chapters and scenes need to be pinned to a word count? Like I've heard you have to limit your chapters to 2,000 words.
Yeah, so that's a good question. With everything writing wise, nothing's a hard and fast rule, but there are guidelines of why there are word count recommendations. And one of them is like, if we take some of our favorite stories, the average of those scenes or chapters will probably fall in the same area. And the reason it works out that way is because it is really just enough to get what you need to say through in the most concise, compelling way possible. Now, like we saw for the Harry Potter scenes, some of our scenes are going to be longer. That's just natural. And if I remember correctly, because I've broken down every scene in Harry Potter and then broken down the chapters, I want to say that her chapters are anywhere between like 3,500 to 6,500 words. So she's in a lot of her chapters, she has one scene or she'll have parts of 2 scenes. Does that help?
Yeah. And I think there's a couple more questions on length. So some people have said, I'm just going to kind of group a number of them and we can kind of talk through a few. So some have said, how long is a good chapter? And so I think that kind of answers or gets into that, which is, a couple scenes potentially. Someone also asked if the scene length of 1,500 to 2,000 holds for fantasy because they feel like it's been shorter based on more recent books like Priory of the Orange Tree. Yeah. And then someone else also asked about how word count for a scene would change for a short story or a novella, if the entire chapter itself is kind of 1,500 to 2,500 words.
Right. So, a lot of good questions. So we'll start with the last one first, because that's probably the easiest. For a short story, I've seen this go both ways where you can have shorter scenes. So anywhere from, let's say, 800 to 1,200 words. And then you would have more of those for your short story. I've also seen where they have less scenes because maybe it doesn't take place over too long of a period of time. So it really kind of just depends on your style. But if we think about something like a full novel and we're writing maybe a fantasy thriller, we would probably actually, let me go back to this slide because this will probably make more sense if I can show you guys. Excuse all the flashing. Okay, so actually I'm going to go back to this one. Oh my gosh, sorry you guys. I just want to point it out. Okay, so let's say we're writing, well, really any kind of book, and we want to end our chapter on a cliffhanger. So a cliffhanger could either be, and can you guys see where my cursor is?
We could for a second, but I think it's gone now. Oh, there it is.
Gosh.
Yes.
Okay. Here we go. Okay. So the cliffhanger would usually be around that turning point moment or the crisis moment. So imagine in the Harry Potter scene, if we wanted to end that on a cliffhanger, make that chapter break on a cliffhanger, we would end it where maybe he's deciding, should I say something about joining Slytherin or not? We could even have it be at the turning point when the hat says you might do really well in Slytherin. Tons of other wizards have done good in Slytherin. So the cool thing about when you write a scene, I know we're talking about length, I'll go back there in a second. When you write a scene and you know it's complete, then you can start breaking it up anywhere in here that you want to create the kind of effect you want. So I can't remember how I was going to relate that to word count, but okay, because something like a thriller, you might want to break it up where chapter 1 is like the goal, the inciting incident, the turning point, and then chapter 2 might be the crisis, climax, resolution, and they're very short to control that, how it feels to read through it. Where in something like a fantasy, you might have 3 scenes that are complete within one chapter. And if you look at something like, I was just reading a chapter from a Game of Thrones this morning, and you can easily see where in one point of view chapter, there's like 3 different complete scenes and they feel longer, but because we read sci-fi fantasy, we don't tend to care as much as someone who wants a fast-paced thriller would, they want something different. They want a different experience. So what other questions did we have in there?
I think there's just a lot of things about kind of word count. I will say, I think for everyone as well, one of the things to think about is that, if your scene is at 1,500 words every single time, that does not also necessarily mean it's a good scene. I think there's going to be nuance in there as well. I do want to talk about the scene elements while we're on this slide, because someone had a question about the order for these, and if these have to be in order, and what happens if they're not in order in a particular scene.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And logically, they should be in order because there wouldn't be a time where you have a resolution before there's a decision. So I'm trying to think of, and you also wouldn't have a choice before something forces you into a choice. So I would say when in doubt, put them in this order, because it creates that arc of like, here's my goal. All this conflict happens. Now I can't do what I want. So I'm going to do this other thing instead. I love seeing that kitty stretch back there.
Yeah.
So cute.
Running around. Someone asked about this in normal life scenes. So like, what if there are scenes where nothing major is happening? Like if we're just getting to know characters or seeing relationships between them, but there isn't like a real choice.
Right. So this is fun because I was reading a book. I don't know if you guys have ever read the book Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. It's not fantasy or sci-fi. But it's a very slow, like she's very average. She stays inside all the time. So her life is very small. And I always use it as an example because if that author can put this scene structure in that book where the character's agoraphobic and, doesn't even want to ask the IT guy for help at work, you can build structure. So as an example, there's a scene where she's the one big time she goes out to do anything is she's going to the liquor store down the street to buy alcohol. And then the guy at the liquor store, they have this rapport because she comes in a lot. And he says one little thing that she interprets as he's judging me kind of for the first time. So her decision becomes, do I really want this alcohol to kind of feed my addiction? Because she does have a little bit of a problem, or, and risk this guy further judging me or seeing me for the problem that I have. Or am I going to go home and not feed my addiction and my problem and miss out on drinking alcohol? So that scene builds a lot between the character Eleanor and the guy at the liquor store. And it's nothing crazy. There's no car crashes or anything major happening, but that decision, it's very important to her and it shows what her priorities are. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it totally makes sense. And again, I think what you said at the very beginning, which is like when we choose to include something, it's there for a reason, right? Like even if it's not like a big scene where like everything turns, just like you said, it's showing something and we're getting something from that. I want to talk a little bit about resolutions because a couple of people have had questions about that. So some have just asked you to talk about resolution's a little bit more in general, but someone specifically asked, how does the resolution of one scene leading into the next scene work when you have a dual or multiple point of view?
Okay. That's a good question. So let's just talk in scenes, because remember, we can break this up into chapters however we want. But let's say we have in something like Game of Thrones, because I'm sure most of us are familiar with those characters. Let's say Jon Snow will have a complete scene or maybe two scenes in a row in one chapter, right? Then we go to Ned Stark, and then we go to Cersei. So, and then maybe we go back to Jon Snow. So yeah, Jon Snow knows nothing. I see that in the chat. So Jon Snow's whatever decision and resolution he makes in that scene, we're going to skip over Ned Stark's scene if we were planning this book and skip over Cersei. And then that Jon Snow's first scene would lead into Jon Snow's second scene. So as an example, I'm making this up because I don't remember if this is the exact way it happens, but he's in Winterfell at the beginning. We see in his point of view, he wants more for himself because he's known as the bastard, right? And then the guys from the Night's Watch come in. So his decision in that scene might be like, I want something more. I want to join the Night's Watch. Then we don't see him for 4 scenes. And in the next scene that we see him, it's like Benjen Stark is leaving. Jon Snow is trying to go with him. So those 2 scenes of Jon's connect to each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think talking more about resolutions, some people have asked, like, does the resolution have to happen in the scene itself? Because sometimes it makes sense to have it in another scene. And I think sometimes the word resolution in like gets people tripped up because it's not like every scene is like tied in a neat bow, if that makes sense.
Right.
But like, what is that kind
well,
of
and
mean?
I think the question, what we're feeling is that most times in a, can you see my cursor now?
Yes.
Okay. So, sorry. So most times in a chapter, we'll have the resolution in the beginning of the next chapter. So as readers, we're used to feeling that the resolution of a scene isn't at the end of a chapter. So that might be where the question's coming from, because as readers, we feel this. And J.K. Rowling does this a lot. So she'll have within a chapter, she'll have the goal, the inciting incident, turning point, crisis, climax, and then she will end her chapter. Then the next chapter starts with that last scene's resolution, the goal of the next scene, and then, you know, on and on in the structure. So you do always want a resolution. And I'm trying to think of an example of what would be a bad example. Imagine that a character makes a decision. So the easiest example I always like to say is, okay, we're driving to the market. There's traffic. We don't know why. The turning point of our scene is that the road we normally take is closed. So we have to figure out, is it worth going to the market if I have to do a 30-minute, drive around town? But then we also know, like, maybe it's my kid's birthday. So yes, it is worth the extra time, right? So our decision to keep going to the market, we want to know how the character feels about that, or like what they're anticipating, because otherwise as readers, we don't necessarily know, like, are we okay with that decision? Are we not happy? Do you not want to go to that market because your husband's girlfriend works there? Or, there could just be so many things. So that's partially why the resolution is important, is because here's a result of the decision. Is the character feeling proud of their decision? Are they feeling like they just made the worst case scenario decision? And then how does that emotion carry into the beginning of their next scene?
Yeah. And I find, yeah, totally. And I find it helpful, again, thinking about like what you were talking about, dividing scenes from chapters, right? Because the chapter break is like formatting, I think, in some ways, right, of like, it's almost like the commercial break, right? Like, it's right, like, if you think about it in a TV show, right? Like where would they cut to commercial and come back? Like, what's that right point? And just like you were saying, I like to think about this in like, the Goblet of Fire scene where where they pull Harry's name out, right? And it's like, right, there's a chapter end when they're like Harry Potter, but then it's right, not like it skips somewhere else. It's like a continuation of that same scene of what happens right with Harry. And like, that's would be a great example. Yeah, that would be where all the eyes come to him, right? And then the commercial break is, and then it zooms right back in, and it's where, and so that's all the scene, right?
Yeah. And to that point, imagine if there was no resolution to that scene and we did skip somewhere else, and you're like, well, wait a minute. What happened? Everybody was shocked, and what happened about it? So
Yeah.
You would, as a reader, you would feel if this stuff's missing, you just might not have the language to express what's wrong.
Yep, exactly. Okay, let me see. Someone asked if we're not addressing, we're taking all the questions from here. We just have almost 60 and we've already answered like 20. So don't worry. We're trying to get through as many as we can. Okay. Someone asked, I thought scenes were always based on setting. I have multiple scenes in one setting, but if the characters move, I break into another scene. Is that wrong?
Yeah, so that's a good question because that's typically how scenes are defined if you look them up. And I know that like some MFA programs might even teach that. And it's really squishy because in theory, you could have a scene, you could have multiple scenes like you're describing in the same location. There could be 3 or so meaningful arcs of change, one in each scene, and that's fine. For your specific scenes, I would ask, is the goal the same? Is it a scene goal or is it a sequence goal that character is pursuing over multiple scenes? Because, for example, I'm thinking back, I always use Harry Potter because I'm so familiar with it, but when he's trying to help Hagrid get rid of his dragon, right? Because Hagrid's hatched an illegal dragon. So there's a sequence of Harry's overarching sequence goal is to help Hagrid get rid of the dragon. But within that sequence, there are multiple scenes of like, I need to go down to the hut and see what's happening. We wrote a letter to Charlie, Ron's brother, and then we also need to get the dragon to the roof. So there are little mini milestones where the micro goal changes, but that overarching sequence goal is the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think some of the stuff can get super mind boggling when you think about it. And for me, it's helpful to come back to like these 5 commandments and think, okay, with this sequence of events, like what is the crisis, what's the climax, resolution, etc. Some people have asked about breaking these rules. So someone said, didn't Tolkien break a lot of these rules? Someone asks, what do you do when your favorite books clearly break all of these rules? Rule breaking.
Yeah, I mean, and so it's funny because with everything, there are going to be people that break rules, right? And I think if that's what you want to do, go for it. But for me, because I would like to be a published author too. I write fantasy. I'm going to follow the rules because I want the best chance of getting a traditional publishing deal and getting my book out in the world. So, that's my goal. If you guys share the same goal, I would suggest following the rules or at least really understanding them before you break them. The other thing too is sometimes with books that we really love, these things are not as obvious as we think. So the structure might be really built in, but you have to look at it in a different perspective. Like, for example, I can use the perspective of pretending I'm J.K. Rowling to analyze a scene. I could use the perspective of Harry Potter and what Harry Potter might view as the inciting incident, the turning point, the crisis, whatever. And this is just kind of one of those different tools of analysis, right? Because when we're writing, we're mostly in the character's head. When we're editing, we can pull out and say kind of, what is my goal for this book? What do I want to do with it? And if I'm breaking a rule, why am I breaking it? And then of course you want to get readers' feedback. And if, you get all green lights as you go through beta readers and editors, then, you're probably fine.
Awesome. So Gabrielle asks, can the scene goal be implicit from the last scene's climax, or should it be more clearly put across to the reader at the start of a scene?
That's a great question. And it can be implied, depending on the scene, you may need to either reiterate if, like, say you're skipping points of view and you've had another point of view since the last scene, you might want to reiterate it just so readers aren't confused. The other thing you could do in the start of your new scene, if the goal has been set up in a previous scene, is color the beginning of the scene with their expectations. So you might not need to restate the goal, but how are they feeling about pursuing that goal and what are they worried about? What are they expecting? So it's almost like a secret way of reminding the reader what the goal is.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. I think we have time for about 1 or 2 more.
Sure.
And Savannah, would you be willing to come into our Facebook group and answer some more questions for anyone who has not had their question answered, since we have so many? Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot about
That's okay. I could talk about scenes all day, so bring it on.
So we will put Savannah in the Facebook group and start a thread for that. And then please go check out her website, savannahgilbo.com. I'm going to drop the link to her podcast in the chat again as well, since she has such great information there to continue to follow up with. Okay, so someone asked about the main difference between sequence goals and scene goals. So would sequence goals be related to the arc of the character?
Well, with everything, you have an external and an internal layer. So, you know, like if we take that Harry Potter example where he's trying to help Hagrid, the external part is I want Hagrid to get rid of the dragon because I don't want to get in trouble, right? But the internal layer is like through these challenges he's facing, he's growing in confidence and in skill, so that by the end he has the confidence and the skill and all of that to face Voldemort. So can you read the question one more time? Because I think I'm missing a piece of it.
Sequence goals and scene goals. Would the sequence goals be related to the arc of the character?
Okay. Yeah. So the way to think about a sequence goal is, because I see this sometimes in drafts where, like, say that you do your outline or you do your first draft, whatever you're doing, and you realize that in 3 or 4 or 5 scenes, your character's doing the same thing. That's probably indicative that that's the sequence goal. So over these 3, 4, 5 scenes, they're trying to accomplish this one big milestone, but then there are stages or steps that they have to take within each scene. So if you notice that, that your goals are the same, try to dig a level deeper and say, okay, yes, they're doing this over the sequence, but in this one scene, how many steps are they trying to move forward? And how will my reader know that we've moved forward? Does that make sense?
Okay. I'm trying to think of one last question if we can get it in. So someone just asked, do you write kind of one scene after another in a book, or do you space scenes out? Steph says it seems difficult to write one scene after another, but maybe I'm not getting the right idea of a scene.
Okay, yeah, and this is a good question because it does depend on your writing style. So let's pretend you're a planner and you have your whole draft mapped out. You might show up to your desk one day and be like, I don't feel like writing a big battle scene, but you know that 2 scenes later, you have a more intimate scene that you feel like writing. So that's fine because you know where you're already headed. You have it mapped out. If you're a pantser, in theory, you can skip around the same way, but you're probably going to end up with more work on the back end because eventually you do want to connect everything. So because of what happened in scene 1, scene 2 is inevitable, or because of the goal and what happened in scene 1, scene 2 happens. Because of scene 1 and 2, scene 3 happens. You know, you want that cause and effect chain built in, because if you don't have that, it's kind of like this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, and you're like, cool, that's a bunch of stuff, you know. Where if you get that cause and effect chain in, that's what creates a story. It's like a snowball rolling downhill that gathers more snow.
Yeah, exactly. Well, honestly, thank you, Savannah. This has been so fantastic. Everybody in the chat has just absolutely been loving what you've shared. Thank you again for this generosity for coming. And then I will connect with you about getting into the Facebook group to start up a thread. Everyone is just absolutely loving it. Please check out Savannah's website, Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast. savannahgilbo.com/podcast. There's so many goodies there, so many great downloads, and so many just amazing things to check out. So that will also be up on the hub as well, so that you can check that out and see the other download links there too. Since I know the chat is just flying by.
It's going crazy. Yeah.
Thanks again, Savannah. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and there's trivia starting now at 3 p.m. in the networking room. Bye, everyone.